the pursuit of happiness. One man who had the resources to search hard after happiness found it to be terribly elusive. Solomon ruled Israel when it was prosperous and powerful. As we've seen, he had the treasure, the time, and the talent to engage in the pursuit of happiness. The book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible is his journal. And as a king, again, he had the opportunity and the resources to pursue the rewards of wisdom, pleasure, and work. Yet the tone of his writing, if you read through it, it reveals that late in life he looked back on his life with a sigh of regret. Among other things, there were limits to his happiness. Look what it says. Let's read the passage, Ecclesiastes 4, 1 through 3. There are 5 places in the book of Ecclesiastes where it uses the word happy, and we're going to look at each one of them. You'll notice it here. Not very happy, but it talks about it. Ecclesiastes 4, he writes, "Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun." It says, "I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter." The oppressed are the deceived and the defrauded. They are those who have been taken advantage of, and they're not able to get justice. They are, in other words, the humble. That's what the word humble means in the Bible. Those who lack the resources to turn justice in their favor. They are taken advantage of, deceived, and defrauded. Solomon goes on to say not only was this true, he goes on to say power was on the side of their oppressors. Power is vigor. So not only are these oppressed being defrauded, their pursuers and their oppressors are vigorous and strong, and they are able to wear down the oppressed. Solomon goes on to observe not only this dynamic, but something that is disturbing. They have no comforter. He says it twice. There is no one to comfort the oppressed in their bereavement. Not only are they being taken advantage of, there's no one that is extending compassion to them. There's no source of compassion. In the Greek and Roman Empire, they have a word for the gods, and the word is apatheia. It's the word from which we get the word apathetic. But for Greeks, it wasn't just that the gods were bereft of compassion. When you think of apathy, somebody who doesn't care, it wasn't simply that their gods were bereft of the ability to care. They were incapable of being able to care. That's what apatheia means when the Greeks use it with respect to their God. And the reason why they believed this, they thought this, is that God couldn't allow, or gods couldn't allow what was happening under the sun to happen and to be emotionally impacted. The gods must be apatheia, because they reasoned, look what's happening to people, the oppressed and the oppressors. A God who is emotionally engaged could not be emotionally engaged and allow to happen what is happening. If looking around at atrocities, which they did, leads to wondering about the emotional engagement of God, we're in worse shape than they are. The 20th century was the most murderous century in recorded history. 100 million human beings were killed in the wars during the 20th century, and more than 100 million more were killed by their fellow human beings in political repression, massacre, and genocide. I read an article and it said, it is sometimes argued that the modern world is more humane than ever before. The writer says in some ways it is. The paradox, however, is that we save more victims than ever before. That's true. And slaughter more victims than ever before. The Rwandan bloodbath was one of the fastest massacres in history. In less than 3 months, machete-wielding Hutus ferociously slaughtered more than 800,000 Tutsis. The clearest case of genocide since the Holocaust, carried out at probably more than twice the casualties and at 3 times the speed. It was the equivalent of more than 2 World Trade Center slaughters. More than 2 World Trade Center slaughters every single day for 100 days. Writer went on to say, modern people have demonstrated a consistently poor response to modern evil. In 2001, the world responded to America's tragedy with an outpouring of sympathy and aid, which was appropriate. We are all Americans now, the French said famously. But in 1994, when the defenseless Tutsis cried for help, the watching world, this writer said, watched and turned away. Not a single country went to their rescue. Part of the uniqueness of our time is that we are the first to live when it is possible to know of almost all the world's atrocities as they happen. If you watch the news, we have no buffer. It's not the way it's always been. We see it all, and we see it all in real time. And we often know enough to know it's almost better not to know more. Do you ever feel that? Do you ever feel overloaded and overwhelmed by what you see on the news? And you just have to turn away. You have to put down the paper. You have to turn the TV set to another channel. You know what the problem with Solomon? He was too smart for his own good. He couldn't wall out the cries of the oppressed. He pursued pleasure in wine and building projects and all kinds of things. The problem was that he was too wise to allow these pursuits of pleasure to wall out the cries of the oppressed. That's what happiness tends to do. Happiness builds walls. We tend to want to live in a happy place, to wall out the unhappiness that's around. Happiness builds walls. God builds bridges. Look what it says in Isaiah 32. It talks about a king who would be as wise and wiser than Solomon, a king yet to be born in Solomon's time, but with something that Solomon was unwilling or unable to do. A king with compassion, who would not pursue pleasure and allow that pursuit to get in the way of coming to the aid of the oppressed. Look what it says, Isaiah 32. See, Isaiah writes, a king will reign in righteousness, and rulers will rule with justice. Each man will be like a shelter from the wind and a refuge from the storm, like streams of water in the desert and the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. No longer will the fool be called noble, nor the scoundrel be highly respected. For the fool speaks folly, his mind is busy with evil. He practices ungodliness and spreads error concerning the Lord. The hungry he leaves empty, and from the thirsty he withholds water. The scoundrel's methods are wicked. He makes up evil schemes to destroy the poor with lies, even when the plea of the needy is just. But the noble man makes noble plans, and by noble deeds he stands. The scoundrel's methods, Isaiah writes, are wicked. He makes up evil schemes to destroy the poor with lies, even when the plea of the needy is just. This is what Solomon threw a penalty flag at, the strong oppressing the weak. Isaiah writes under the inspiration of God and calls that foolish. He prophesied that a king would come who would make a difference, the kind of difference Solomon was either unable or unwilling to make. It says, see, a king will reign in righteousness and rulers will rule with justice. Not a king who was so busy chasing happiness that he was too busy to respond to the cries of the oppressed. This king would not only be caring himself, but would build a kingdom of caring people. Each man in this kingdom, each one of these kingdom people, these citizens of this righteous kingdom of God, each man will be like a shelter from the wind, refuge from the storm, like streams of water in the desert, and the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. Kingdom citizens would be shelters, places of refuge, places of solace, places where the oppressed could go to find relief. The kingdom would be a breeding ground for noble plans. Noble plan. Noble is an important word. It's the word used, and it's translated free will. Free will as describing an offering. There were noble offerings. They were free will offerings. And what it is at its heart, it's a voluntary, uncoerced offering. That's what a noble offering. It's a free will offering. It is a voluntary, uncoerced offering. Let me give you an example. Exodus. Moses summoned Bezalel and Aholiab and every skilled person to whom the Lord had given ability. This is when they're walking around, just about to go into their wilderness wandering, and they have to create a place for Moses in particular and the people to be able to connect with God. They're going to build the tabernacle, this movable place where Moses could meet with God. So anyways, it goes on and says, anybody to whom the Lord had given ability and was willing to come and do the work, they received from Moses all the offerings the Israelites had brought to carry out the work of constructing the sanctuary. And the people continued to bring, it says in the NIV, free will offerings. You know, another word for free will would be noble. Free will offerings, noble offerings. Wasn't mandated, wasn't coerced. It was voluntary. Whoever wants to bring it, bring it. And that was a noble offering. Noble in the passage in Isaiah, it's not talking about an offering in that same way. What it's talking about is voluntary, uncoerced concern for the oppressed and the poor. This would characterize the kingdom of God. When I think of noble, my father-in-law passed away a year and a half ago. And in talking about him, talked about a word that characterized him as noble. Asked a question at the time, one that I haven't and couldn't find an answer to. Said, how many times was there a car on a mission of mercy and Dad was behind the wheel, dropping off food, bringing relatives to the hospital in Rochester after having worked a shift? I don't know how many times. Noble. What gets in the way of nobility? We're going to answer that a couple of times this morning in a couple of different ways. What gets in the way of nobility? And you know what nobility is. Voluntary, uncoerced concern and activity with respect to the poor and the oppressed. What gets in the way of it? One thing that I'm going to suggest is that we're too busy trying to get noble offerings to function as sin offerings. I'm going to tell you what I mean, but as the principle. We're too busy trying to get noble offerings to function as sin offerings. There's a couple different kinds of offerings in Judaism. Not all offerings were noble, but all of them were free will. Sin offerings were mandatory. You had to do it. And if you didn't do it, you were kicked out of the community and perhaps killed. Now, the sin offering had to be perfect. Here's what it says in Leviticus. Do not offer to the Lord the blind, the injured, or the maimed in terms of an animal to function as a sacrifice. Do not place any of these on the altar as an offering made to the Lord by fire. And so when you're looking to cover sin, you couldn't just pick out any old animal that you had lying around. It had to be perfect to be the sin offering. Once the sin offering was done, taken care of, once forgiveness was effected, then free will offerings could be presented. They came second. So the first offering that needed to be taken care of was the sin offering. It was mandatory. Once that's out of the way, you're taking care of that. The second offering could be a free will offering, and not surprisingly, that didn't need to be perfect. Service doesn't need to be perfect. Sin offerings do. Look what it says. You may, however, present as a free will offering, a noble offering, an ox or a sheep that is deformed or stunted. One possible reason for lack of nobility, again, is that we try to turn noble offerings into sin offerings. Let me tell you what I mean. We try to use service to get forgiven. How do we do that? We try to use service to get forgiven. Do you remember the way it works in Judaism? What offering comes first? The sin offering. It has to be perfect. Is our service perfect? No. Can we use our service to wipe away sin? No, we can't. You know what we do? Let the sin offering take care of the sin offering. Get that resolved. Then let the noble offering be the noble offering. Free will. Your service doesn't need to be perfect. What I think we do is when we get all that mixed up, we don't get the forgiveness piece resolved. What we end up doing is trying to use our service to get forgiven. And what that looks like is we're serving, and one eye is on the individual we're serving, and the other eye is on God. I hope you're looking at this. I hope you're looking at how much money I'm giving here. Maybe it'll cover for what I did last night. You know, the thing I did, the thing you did last night, certainly if if I did that, I could pay for it this way. Do you understand what that is? That's mixing up offerings. That's trying to use a noble offering to do what only a sin offering can do. So I guess here's my recommendation. Take care of your sin thing. Say, how do we do that? Well, that offering needed to be perfect. It needs to be something God provides. And what you need to do is believe He did it. Do you remember what the message of the gospel is in the last series? The message of, we used a word. Remember the word? A word Paul took from the relational sphere and applied it to the sacred sphere. Do you remember the word? It's the word used to describe what the message of the cross is. The gospel, the message of the cross, the message of reconciliation. Reconciliation. And what we talked about, do you remember what the message of reconciliation was? Maybe you catch pieces of it. God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And putting faith in the message of reconciliation, you know what that does? That takes care of the sin problem. How do you take care of your sin problem? You know what you do? You believe the message. You believe what Jesus did. God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And you know what your piece is relative to the sin you did yesterday and the day before and the day before that? To understand that when God sent Christ, He was removing your sin as a barrier. So now what do you need to do in order to have that become part of your believing self? You need to believe it. Believe it. Take care of the sin thing. Don't try to think that your service or what you give or how often you go to church, all that stuff can't cover sin, because sin offerings need to be perfect, and yours aren't. Jesus was. Believe that. Then you know what you can do? Okay, now, the sin thing. Now let service be a free will, voluntary, uncoerced expression. That's why I think, you know what gets in the way of nobility? We haven't taken care of the sin thing, and we end up trying to use a noble offering to accomplish what only a sin offering can. That's one thing. We'll come up with another thing. A righteous king would come, Isaiah says, whose kingdom would be noble. But the noble man makes noble plans, and by noble deeds he stands. So a noble guy, if we look in the Bible, Jesus was noble to the nth degree. A guy who is in his rearview mirror, not as, but he was amazing, was Moses. Look what it says, Exodus 3, 6 through 8. Moses was connecting with God. It says Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land. There are 4 statements here that describe the character of God. These are great statements. I have seen their misery. I have heard them crying. I am concerned about their suffering. I have come down to rescue them. That's sweet. God says, I have seen their misery. I have heard them crying. I am concerned about their suffering. I have come down to rescue them. As is the case with God, when he sends this concern out, it always gets embodied in flesh and blood. I haven't seen God. I have seen people who represented God. Jesus represented God. There's individuals who carry around the image, who are helpful, who represent God. God's concern is always incarnated in flesh and blood. That's why not only will the king in the kingdom be righteous, but his people will be kingdom people as well. Shelters, rocks, streams. As is the king, so are his people. See, God hears suffering. He sees tears. He's concerned about suffering. He takes steps to alleviate it. And so do his people. The early church, talked about a couple weeks back, was characterized by this capacity. In the midst of the 3rd century, the plague of Cyprian claimed the lives of 5,000 people a day in Rome. Pagan Rome was completely ill-prepared to deal with something like this, and the early church believed that God loved humanity and that he wanted them, his people, to love both him and others, and they did that. Instead of fleeing disease and death, early Christians went about ministering to the sick and helping the poor. The widowed, the crippled, the blind, the orphaned, and the aged. Their care was so extensive. What the Emperor Julian tried to do, he tried to copy the church's welfare system. He tried to mandate care. And how well do you think that succeeded? You can't mandate noble. Couldn't do it. Voluntary, uncoerced concern, he couldn't do that. You can't make that a law. And he couldn't copy it. People wouldn't. But the Christians, the people of the Roman Empire, were forced to admire the works and dedication of the church, even if they didn't like the church. And they would say, look how they love one another. That was heard on the streets. You know what they were seen as? Kingdom people. And that reflected on the God who was their king. God who is king. So that's about what Moses did then. Okay, so Moses was afraid to look at God, but God was looking both at Moses and through Moses to the crying, the suffering, and the compassion. And here's what it says about Moses. Hebrews 11, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. It says he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. Moses bypassed the pleasures of sin. Is sin pleasurable? Absolutely. And if we are hell-bent on pursuing pleasure, the path of pleasure and the path of sin coincide. Now, again, we've got to be careful here. And we will be, but what Moses did when it came to a choice, there was what God wanted him to do in terms of pouring out his life for the oppression of what happened with his people. And then there was stay in Egypt and stay in power, and what he did, he chose to be mistreated with the people of God rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin for a short time. You know what? There's a juncture where serving ceases to be pleasurable. Is there pleasure in serving? Yes. Is there always pleasure in serving? No. No. Serving is not always pleasurable. There is what you want to do will go in this direction. Then there is what they need, it will go in that direction. And there is a split in the road. By faith, Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. It's interesting that the reason why Moses was able to persevere is because he saw him who is invisible. We tend to believe that the kind of commitment and courage that Moses exemplified leads to experiencing the reality of God. So if you're consecrated, if you're committed, if you are courageous, then you experience the reality of God. Interestingly, in this passage, what it says, that's flipped around. It wasn't commitment and courage and consecration that led to experiencing the reality of God. Experienced the reality of God led to commitment, courage, and consecration. He endured because he saw him who is invisible. How could he pull it off? He saw him who is invisible. And he could see where God's concern was, and he was able to draw some concern from the concern he experienced with God. That seems to be the way it works. There's a couple of images for what we are to be as people of God. This is a cup. This is a piece of PVC. Let's call it a conduit. Both of these things are similar in that they are vehicles through which water or liquids are transmitted. Would you agree? Let's say water. Okay? You can put water in a cup and you can put water to a conduit. What's the difference? This fills up, and it fills up, sometimes it overflows, and sometimes that's an image for what the Christian life is. We get filled up with concern, and then when we get filled up and it overflows, it spills out onto people. That's an image for Christianity, isn't it? Overflow, people giving from the overflow. What's the difference between this and this? This is a conduit, not a cup. And the difference between this is this doesn't overflow. Things don't stay in the conduit. It experiences fluid as the fluid goes through it. So fluid goes in and through. I guess here's the question. Which one of these is a better characterization for what the Christian life is like? We get so filled up that it overflows. We're so full that I have to give. I'm so joyful. I have no more joy to hold. I'll give you some. Or is it this? We experience God as he passes through us to others. Which one? This one. This one. Sometimes we don't experience God because he's not going through us to others. And that seems to be what nobility is about. Voluntary, uncoerced concern for others that ends up becoming the means whereby we experience things from him as they go through us to others. Now we experience them, but as they go through and they don't get bottlenecked. Does that make sense? What gets in the way of nobility? One answer is that we use noble offerings. We try to make them into sin offerings. We talked about that. Another thing is we ask the wrong questions. Look what it says in 2 Timothy. Paul writes to Timothy, excuse me. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, lovers of pleasure, rather than lovers of God. Having a form of godliness, but denying its power. It talks about questions that will determine courses of action in the last days, and these are the questions. Will it benefit me? Will it earn me money? Will it give me pleasure? What should I do with my life? Well, what will benefit me? What will earn me money? What will give me pleasure? What career should I embark upon? What will benefit me? What will earn me money? What will give me pleasure? What church should I go to? What will benefit me? What will earn me money? What will give me pleasure? And again, these are questions that we ask. I guess here's my question. Do these questions allow us to pursue nobility? If those are the questions that we ask, those aren't the questions that lead to nobility. What will benefit me? What will earn me money? What will give me pleasure? And if we're looking for positive answers to those, nobility is voluntary, uncoerced concern for the poor and the oppressed, and that doesn't lead in the direction of personal pleasure. Now, there are instances where serving is pleasurable, but there's instances where it isn't. And again, it's not that these questions erase godliness. It says, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. You can have a godliness that caters to personal preferences, that promises to put more money in your pocket, that promises to be pleasing. The only problem with that godliness is there's no power in it. Having a form of godliness but denying its power, there's enough reality to keep the outside looking nice, but inside it leads to being hollow, no power, nothing real, nothing substantive. That comes through this. Experiencing God as he comes through, this power in that. What do we do with this? Gets in the way of nobility? Again, I'm not pointing a big bony finger at you and not at me. Our need to get what will benefit us, earn us money, and give us pleasure. Is it possible to be directed by these questions and become noble? I don't think so. In our day, the church appeals to people, come and be pleased. And it's okay to want to be pleased, but I think that there is a bait and switch here, isn't it? If we're pulling people into a religious environment on the basis, and again, on the basis of, was it pleasing? That's a bait and switch, isn't it? Because you know what God's going to ask? For nobility. What is pleasing and what promotes nobility is not the same thing. Not the same thing. There was a thing in fact, I put it on the back of the worship folder. From the step 7, the prayer in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Look what it says. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. This is a great prayer. And here's what it says. When an individual comes to the point of writing down a moral inventory, sharing it, and then I am a person who gets an opportunity, the privilege to be able to listen to these things. We'll listen to another one today. I do it very often. I'll always go into step 6 and 7. Step 6 and 7 asks this question, and then I'll reference this. Are we now willing to let God remove from us all the things that we've admitted are objectionable? In admitting the things that are objectionable, it says, are we now willing that God should remove those things? And if we are, then we come to step 7. And what it is, here is step 7. God, I'm willing, you should have all of me. You know what we tend to do with our lives? We tend to do with our lives what we do with the laundry. We separate into lights and darks. You know, lights and darks. And you put the lights, the good things, into this basket and the dark things into this basket, depending on our personality. Some of us like to keep the light things for ourselves and give God the darks. Here, take care of these. Bring them back next week. Some of us, we give God the light and we keep the darks. In this way, you know what it says? They don't get separated into lights and darks. It all goes into one basket. In this basket, with everything about you, your strengths and your weaknesses, the things you do and the things you don't do, the places you're qualified and the places you're unqualified, the things in your life that bring you to God and push you away, all goes into the basket. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. Now, what's God going to do with this basket? Be careful. I ask that you will remove from me every single defective character which stands in the way of my happiness. Remove every single defective character that stands in the way of my joyfulness. Usefulness. Would you agree with me? The things that stand in the way of happiness and the things that stand in the way of usefulness are not the same things. Would you agree with me? Sometimes the things that make us useful don't make us happy, but they make us useful. And there's instances of happiness in being useful. In fact, I dare say that if you shoot at happiness, you're not going to hit it. And you'll never hit usefulness. If you shoot at usefulness, you can hit that. And there are times when happiness comes alongside. Here's a prayer. We're going to have the worship team come up just in a second. I think it's a great prayer. You make it yours. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I ask now that you remove from me every single defective character. You think of your basket that you give to God. And you're saying, here it is. Here's who I am. All of me. Remove from me everything that stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Give me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Father, thank you for what you notice, that you do see tears, you hear the crying, you are concerned, and you come down to rescue. You do so through your people. And it's not something you can force. It's not something that happens overnight. Our heart gets bigger. We see more clearly, little by little. Not an overnight thing. It never is. It's gradual. It begins seemingly with a direction, a willingness. We come before you. We ask you to remove the things that stand in the way of usefulness, things inside of us, not outside of us. The things that get in the way of our usefulness are not outside, they're inside. We demand what benefits us, makes us money. And again, this is stuff we get caught in, and you're the one that has to remove the things that stand in the way of usefulness. Would you do that in us? Would you help us be a community, a kingdom, in which we're becoming more shelters, refuges, rocks in a weary land? For Jesus' sake, amen.